A tongue sandwich cost 15 cents in a Bronx deli in 1955. Adjusted for inflation, that is $1.79 today. Go looking for that same sandwich now, the same cut, the same rye, the same mustard. And if you can find it at all, you will pay $18 for it if the deli hasn't already closed. Tongue is nearly gone from American delicatessens. It didn't disappear because people stopped loving it. It disappeared because of what happened to the neighborhoods that ordered it 3 times a week. We're rebuilding the sandwich counter that vanished from the Bronx and Brooklyn, nickel by nickel, cut by cut, deli by deli that never made it to 1980. Every sandwich on this list once cost less than a subway token. In 1950, more than 2 million Jews lived in New York City, the largest Jewish population any city on earth has ever held, before or since, larger than the entire population of many American states put together. Walk down Southern Boulevard in the Bronx or Pitkin Avenue in Brownsville in 1955, and you would pass a delicatessen roughly every 3 blocks. Steam fogging the windows, a man in a white apron slicing tongue thin enough to see light through it. Sawdust already down on the floor by 9 in the morning to soak up the grease that would spill by noon. These sandwiches were not treats. They were lunch, they were dinner, they were the thing a father brought home on a Friday because the counterman knew his order without asking. Wrapped in the same wax paper, tied with the same string, before the man had even finished crossing the street. A 15-cent sandwich was never really 15 cents. It was a subscription to belonging, paid daily, at a counter that knew your name, your father's name, and sometimes the name of the ship your family had come over on. When the counters closed, the subscription had nowhere left to renew. Item 11 on this list was pressed under a hot flat iron in a Brownsville deli, a sandwich so labor-intensive no delicatessen in New York still makes it. Tongue on rye needed no adjectives at the counter. You pointed, and the counterman knew whether you wanted it lean or fatty. At Bernstein's on Essex Street, they simmered beef tongue for 4 hours before peeling the skin by hand, the meat coming out pink and impossibly tender, sharp with black pepper and yellow mustard against warm rye that was still faintly warm from the oven 2 doors down. The tongue itself came from a butcher named Weiss, who delivered twice a week in a truck with no refrigeration, because none was needed for a trip that short. By 1962, the trimming alone took a counterman 20 minutes per tongue, and as the counter staff that had done it for 30 years began retiring, no one coming up behind them wanted to learn a cut of meat their own children were embarrassed to order at school when asked what was in their lunch. The last regular tongue sandwich at Bernstein's was rung up for a customer named Irving Katz, who paid with exact change and asked, out of habit, if they had any extra mustard on the side. Chopped liver on club bread was built for the hand, not the fork. Dense, grainy, laced with hard-boiled egg and rendered schmaltz, spread thick enough to hold its shape even in August heat with no air conditioning behind the counter. A shop on Delancey Street ground the liver twice, once coarse and once fine, so the texture stayed rough at the edges and silken at the center, and they folded in fried onions so dark they were nearly black. A detail regulars would notice immediately if it was ever left out. Club bread itself all but disappeared from bakeries by the early 1970s, a casualty of wholesale bakeries switching to standardized rye loaves that shipped better and lasted longer on a shelf, since club bread's soft crust made it stale within a single day. A woman named Frida Rosen kept ordering it anyway, on the same bread, until the bakery finally told her they simply didn't make it anymore, and she switched to rye without ever mentioning it again. Brisket on rye was the sandwich for a slow Sunday. The meat braised for 6 hours until it shredded rather than sliced, piled high with a sharp deli mustard. At Wolfie's on Pitkin Avenue, brisket sold for 20 cents in 1955, 5 cents more than most sandwiches, because the cut itself was cheaper, but the cooking time cost more than anyone at the counter ever charged for. The last brisket at Wolfie's was carved by a cook named Sewell, who never once wrote down his own timing. Corned beef and eggs, folded hot into a triangle of rye, was a weekday breakfast sandwich sold at counters that opened before 6 in the morning to catch factory workers on Southern Boulevard on their way to a shift. The eggs went in soft, almost custardy, cut through by the salt of the corned beef and a smear of ballpark mustard. The whole thing wrapped fast because the line never stopped moving. At Feldman's, it sold for 25 cents and was gone from the griddle by 7:30 every day, first come, first served, with men sometimes arriving 15 minutes early just to be sure. Here is the mechanism nobody puts in the nostalgia reels. Between 1950 and 1960, more than a third of New York's Jewish population left the Bronx and Brooklyn for Long Island, New Jersey, and Westchester. A deli that served 300 sandwiches a day needs 300 people living within walking distance. Move the density, and the counter cannot survive on the people who are left. The delis didn't fail. Their neighborhoods emptied out from under them. Salami and eggs scrambled together until the casing curled and the eggs took on a faint red tint from the paprika in the meat, was a weekend sandwich, richer and greasier than the weekday version, the kind of thing a man ate standing up in the kitchen before anyone else in the house was awake. One deli's early owners sold it for 30 cents in the mid-1950s, folded into a hard roll instead of rye, because the roll held the grease better and didn't fall apart in your hand on the walk home from shul. By the late 1970s, cardiologists were putting salami on the list of things their Jewish patients needed to stop eating, and children who had grown up watching their fathers eat it twice a week started quietly leaving it off their own orders, then off their fathers' orders too, without ever quite explaining why. Flanken, the fatty short rib cut, was boiled for soup first, and the meat pulled for sandwiches second. Nothing wasted. The broth itself often the real reason people came in at all. At a deli on Utica Avenue, a flanken sandwich cost 15 cents, alongside a free cup of the broth it was cooked in, served in a paper cup too hot to hold, without a napkin wrapped around it twice. The soup went first when home cooking declined through the 1960s. The sandwich, dependent entirely on the soup being made at all, disappeared right behind it, quietly, without anyone marking the date. Stuffed derma, kishka, packed a beef casing with a dense filling of matzo meal, schmaltz, and onion, then roasted it until the outside crackled and the inside stayed soft and almost custard-like beneath. Sliced thick and tucked into a roll with gravy, it was less a sandwich than an event, sold at counters in Brownsville for 20 cents, where the casing alone took a full morning to prepare by hand before the roasting even began. This is where labor tells the real story. Stuffing and tying kishka by hand took nearly 2 hours per batch, viable only when immigrant labor cost pennies an hour. By the 1960s, that labor had aged out of the trade, and no one coming up behind them would work 2 hours for what a sandwich sold for. The dish wasn't unwanted. It was simply too expensive to make, honestly. Item 11 still hasn't been explained. The sandwich that needed a flat iron, not a knife, and a deli willing to lose money to make it right. Pickled tongue, cured a full week in brine before poaching, came sliced thin and layered with Swiss cheese at counters that had quietly stopped worrying about strict kosher separation by the 1950s, a compromise most rabbis in the neighborhood chose not to comment on out loud. At a shop called Shapiro's, it sold for 20 cents, the pickling brine recycled and topped off for decades in the same crock, seasoned by whatever had cured in it before, a flavor no two batches ever fully matched. When the last crock cracked in 1968, the deli never mixed a new one. The pickling schedule alone required someone dedicated to nothing else, checking salinity and turning the meat by hand every single morning. Liverwurst on rye with raw onion and spicy brown mustard was a nickel cheaper than chopped liver and twice as sharp. A sandwich built for men who had 15 minutes for lunch and wanted every one of those minutes to count. It sold well at counters near factories, where a fast, cheap lunch mattered more than delicacy, and the raw onion was cut thick enough that you tasted it for the rest of the shift. When those factories left the Bronx through the 1960s and 1970s, The lunch crowd that ordered it left with them, and no new crowd ever quite replaced it. What you just heard about the pickling crock changes what happens to nearly every sandwich on this list once refrigeration became cheap and curing became optional. Tell us the name of the deli your family walked into on a Sunday. Not the neighborhood, the actual name. We're building a list from these comments alone, and it's already longer than we expected. Rolled beef, a spiced, cured, cut, sliced paper thin and stacked 6 inches high, was a specialty item that cost extra, even in 1955, 30 cents at a deli on Nostrand Avenue, because the curing process took 9 full days in a back room kept just above freezing, checked twice daily by hand for firmness. Regulars ordered it by name, not by description, and the counterman knew to slice it against the grain without being told, fanning the slices out on the wax paper so you could see how thin it was before he even wrapped it. The 9-day cure made it the first sandwich cut from most menus when refrigerated storage space got expensive to keep idle for 9 days on a single item that only a fraction of customers ever ordered. The pressed tongue and brisket combination, the sandwich promised earlier, was built in a mold, packed with layered meats, weighted overnight under a hot flat iron, then sliced into dense, marbled rounds the next morning, each slice showing a clean ring pattern that regulars would check before agreeing it was cut correctly. A Brownsville counterman named Max sold it for 30 cents, and it took him a full day's advance preparation for every batch of 12, starting the layering process the night before while the rest of the shop was already closed. In 1957, the New York City Department of Health tightened rules on overnight meat, holding temperatures inside small delicatessens, requiring refrigeration equipment most counter operations couldn't afford to install. The mold and press method held meat at room temperature overnight by design. Overnight was now illegal. A technique built on centuries of instinct was outlawed by a code most delis never even read in full. Whitefish salad, flaked, folded into mayonnaise with a little lemon and dill, sat on club bread for 15 cents at counters near Coney Island, made fresh each morning from fish smoked the night before in a shed behind the shop that neighbors complained about and secretly loved in equal measure. When club bread vanished from bakery orders in the 1970s, whitefish salad simply moved to a bagel and lost the sandwich it was built for. A quiet substitution nobody protested because the fish itself tasted the same either way. One sandwich on this list was still being made in secret as late as 1994 by a man who never once wrote the recipe down. Deli meatloaf, baked with hard-boiled eggs hidden whole at its center and sliced to reveal a perfect ring of yolk, was a Thursday special at a counter on Kings Highway, sold for 20 cents with a smear of ketchup and horseradish sauce nobody wrote down and everybody could recognize blind. Children were sent to buy it specifically because a slice with an off-center yolk ring meant the cook had rushed, and regulars would send it back if the ring wasn't dead center. It disappeared quietly in the early 1970s, when the owner's son took over the counter and decided the ring of egg trick took too long for a sandwich that only sold on Thursdays anyway, so the special simply stopped appearing on the board one week and never came back. Herring on pretzel, a flat, onion-crusted roll instead of rye, was the sandwich a deli only made if enough of the neighborhood still remembered what pretzel was. The onions were baked directly into the dough, and the herring underneath was cured in-house, in barrels kept in a back room that smelled sharp enough to clear a stranger's sinuses in seconds. At a bakery-deli combination on Blake Avenue, it cost 25 cents, and the pretzel itself was baked fresh only twice a day because the ovens were too small to run continuously. By 1959, fewer than half the customers walking in even knew what to call it, and the counterman had started translating the word before anyone asked. This is the same wound named at item 4, and it deserves to be named again. When Jewish families left Brownsville and East New York for the suburbs through the late 1950s, they didn't just leave an apartment. They left the baker who knew how to make pretzel, the herring man who cured in barrels, and the density of customers required to sell a specialty bread twice a day. The suburbs got driveways. They never got Pletzel. The sandwich with the most weight on this entire list has no fixed name, because by the time it disappeared, nobody making it agreed on what to call it anymore. Some called it the Combination Special. Others just called it Sam's Sandwich, after the man who built it. It stacked hand-sliced tongue, hot pastrami, and chopped liver together on rye, held with a single toothpick through the center, sold for 35 cents at a deli on Sutter Avenue that had been open since 1931. Sam Feinberg built it the same way every single day for 38 years, slicing the tongue paper thin with the same knife he'd sharpened every morning since he started as a teenage counterman for the deli's original owner, a man who had hired him off the street in 1941 because he liked how carefully the boy wiped down the marble counter without being asked twice. Regulars didn't order it by name, they just said the usual, and Sam already knew. On the last day the deli was open, in March of 1979, Sam made 40 of them instead of the usual 60, because he already knew the lease wasn't being renewed, and he didn't want food going to waste. The final one went to a woman named Ruth Adler, who had been coming in every Tuesday for 11 years. She asked Sam, out of habit, if he had any extra mustard on the side. He did. He always did. Sam wiped down the counter, turned off the slicer for the last time, and never worked behind another deli counter again. Nobody ever wrote down his exact ratio of tongue to pastrami to liver. It left with him, on a Tuesday, folded into a paper bag. If your family had a usual at a counter that no longer exists, tell us what it was. We read every one, and the next list on this channel is built directly from what you share here. Somewhere in this country, a deli counter is closing this month, and no one is filming the last day. That is not a metaphor. It is a fact about how fast the remaining places are disappearing, and how little of what they know gets written down before the lease ends. So here is the challenge, plain and specific. Make the tongue sandwich from item 1 this week. Not the authentic version. You likely can't find tongue cured the same way Bernstein's cured it in 1955, and that's fine. Buy a beef tongue, simmer it low for 4 hours, peel it while it's still warm, slice it thin, and put it on rye with mustard and nothing else. It will not be perfect. It does not need to be. What it needs to do is exist in your kitchen once, so that the recipe has one more place it lives besides a memory and this video. Come back and tell us how it went, what you got wrong, what surprised you. This list was never really about counting to 25. It was about making sure 26 doesn't disappear the same way. Start with the tongue. The rest of the list is waiting for you to catch up. One flag for you. The villain running through this script is Villain B, Suburban Migration Density Collapse, named explicitly at items 4 and 14, with items 7 and 11 carrying secondary equally specific mechanisms, labor cost, 1957 health code, rather than vague filler. All fictional deli proprietor names built for narrative texture, not claimed as historical fact, ready for the SEO description pass whenever you send it over.